Okay, good evening, everybody. This is just a sound check. Miss Rodriguez, can you hear me? If you can give me a thumbs up. Thank you so much. Good evening to all of our attendees this evening. Welcome to the School District of Lee County's inaugural Wellness Wednesday for Parents event. My name is Lori Brooks, and I am the Director of School Counseling and Mental Health Services for the school district. And we thank you for spending some time with us this evening, investing in this essential learning for our families. Wellness Wednesdays, this is our inaugural event, but they will be held monthly in the evening on the same day that our secondary students engaged in school-based Wellness Wednesday instruction through our Student Wellness Wednesday initiative. Each month, the district will present on a different wellness topic. Tonight's topic is suicide signs, risk factors, and prevention with Dr. Susan King, who is a pediatric psychologist from Golisano Children's Hospital. Before I formally introduce Dr. King, I will make a few announcements and discuss the format for this event. For your planning pleasure, future Wellness Wednesdays for Parent events are planned for April 28th, where we will discuss depression in children. And as we head into summer on May 26th, the topic will be building resiliency in children. And details will be sent via school messenger and our other communication portals as those events draw near. As we turn our attention to this evening's topic, if you are in the live webinar, you may enter questions into the Q&A section that our panelists will address during the Q&A portion of the presentation as time permits. Some of you may be in the live stream version on YouTube, and this is available if our webinar exceeds a certain size so that all of our parents can engage in this learning this evening. Right now, all of you will be in the live setting, but if we exceed capacity, the live stream will be in the YouTube environment so that everyone can still enjoy tonight's topic and learn from it. We are also recording the presentation this evening for additional viewing on demand. So this topic can be difficult for some of us. So please this evening take breaks as needed and engage in self-care throughout this event as you determine appropriate for your needs. In addition, you will note that we will have information on the screen if you or someone you know is having a mental health crisis or is in need of immediate support. These resources will also be shown at the conclusion of our presentation this evening. I also encourage you, if you feel so inclined, to take a screenshot of these resources, and I will show them now. I apologize, there we go. Okay. So please feel free to take a screenshot of this information. We encourage attendees to keep this information in an accessible place for any such time that we may need to assist our children, other loved ones, or even ourselves. It is now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's expert presenter. Dr. Susan King is currently a pediatric psychologist in the Behavioral Pediatrics Department at Golisano Children's Hospital, where she provides psychological services to school-age children, adolescents, and young adults presenting with emotional and behavioral challenges. Prior to joining the Lee Health System, Dr. King worked as a senior behavioral analyst, clinical director for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, and subsequently as a regional clinical director for a company that managed residential treatment programs for justice-involved youth. Dr. King also has an extensive professional background in nursing home administration. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Florida School of Professional Psychology. Dr. King, welcome this evening, and we express our gratitude to you on behalf of the school district for sharing your knowledge with our parents and our staff this evening.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Can everyone hear me? Okay, excellent. Okay, so I really appreciate, we had, it's my understanding we had an excellent amount of registrations tonight, and I really appreciate people taking the time to find out more about this very important topic. So when Lori made a request that one of us present this topic tonight, I think Dr. Sabo thought of me because Dr. Sabo, who you will be meeting a little later this evening, he thought of me because we have both worked with justice-involved youth, and in that setting, we are presented with a lot of challenges with severe mental health issues and often suicidal gestures and suicidal ideation. So fortunately for both of us, we never had a direct situation in which we were dealing with a completed suicide, but we have had a lot of exposure to suicide gestures and suicidal ideation, as I said. So tonight I'm going to be discussing some data that will hopefully illustrate the scope of the issue that we're here to address. I'll be discussing some suicide terminology. I will be telling you about 2 categories of risk factors. I'll be talking about some protective factors, and then we will discuss preventive approaches for parents and who to call in an emergency. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Okay. Okay, is everybody seeing the first slide? Okay, great. Okay. There we go. It's just going a little slow. There we go. Okay. So suicide is a very serious problem, and this is worldwide. The World Health Organization lists suicide as the 3rd leading cause of death for those that are 15 and 19 years old. However, suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death among children in the 10 to 19 age group in the United States, according to JAMA Pediatrics and others. Suicide rates have doubled in the past decade. And from 2007 to 2016, 57 children in the category of 5 to 9 died by suicide, which was a suicide rate of 0.03 the rate for every 100,000 in this age group. We had a question that was submitted as a part of registration, and that was asking the question, what is the earliest completed suicide? I actually was unable to find that specific reference. However, the CDC and other federal agencies start collecting data at the age of 5. In the early 1900s, Piaget estimated that children understood the finality of death by about age 7. Later theorists determined that that was probably around the age of 5. So whether that's the reason why these things are collected at the age of 5, I can't tell you, but as we go through, you'll understand a little more why 5 would make sense. Okay. So from 2007 to 2016, 3,165 youth ages 10 to 14 died by suicide. So that was a rate of 1.53 per 100,000 in this age group. So of the total 2,982 who died by suicide in this time period, 76.2 were male, 68.6 were white, non-Hispanic. So you see, the numbers grow exponentially as kids are aging, going from 5 all the way up to 19. Now, the study that I reference here with this data concluded that they were looking at poverty among different age categories of people who concluded or completed their suicide. And they found that county level poverty concentration was associated with increased suicide risk among those in the 5 to 19 age group. Okay. Now, the following data comes from a CDC data brief that was published in 2019. After stable trends from the year 2000 to 2007, suicide rates for the 10 to 24 age group increased, while homicide rates declined. The suicide rate for people in the 10 to 14 age category tripled from 2007 to 2017. Another study that was published in Pediatrics in 2016 looked at suicide decedents from ages 5 to 14 from the time period 2003 to 2012 in 17 of the US states. The total number was 693. When the 5 to 11 age group was compared to the 12 to 14 age group, children who died by suicide were more commonly Black. They died by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation, and they died at home. When we talk about this earlier school age group, we're looking at different types of disorders that tend to be associated with this age group. So in the earlier age group, you will see more impulsive type behavior and a different orientation to what they're doing. So we're going to talk more about that in terms of what motivates kids to behave in this way as we go on. So the CDC lists suicide methods as of 2018 as number 1 being firearms, number 2 being suffocation, number 3 being poisoning, and number 4 being other means. There's no real consensus among researchers about the terminology that we use with suicidal ideation and behavior. Suicidal behavior, and I'm just taking a general consensus term here. Suicidal behavior consists of completed suicide, suicide attempts, and suicidal ideation. A completed suicide is an intentional self-inflicted death. The preferred terminology is death by suicide or died by suicide. Attempted suicide is self-injurious behavior with either an ambivalent intent or a certain intent to die. So non-suicidal self-injurious behavior, or non-suicidal self-injury, as I was taught to refer to it, is direct destruction or alteration of body tissue without conscious suicidal intent, but resulting in injury serious enough for tissue damage to occur. This is when we see cutting, burning, and other sort of self-damaging type behavior. Researchers have found that impulsive non-suicidal self-injury occurs in up to 80% of clients with borderline personality disorder, as compared to prevalence estimates of about 4% in the general population of mental health treatment seekers. Suicidal acts pose greater suicide risk and may require different interventions than non-suicidal self-injury. Treatment providers, when presented with this type of behavior, assess intent in order to discriminate between behaviors that are actual suicide attempts. That's a self-injurious behavior with varying levels of intent, to self-harming acts involving no intent to die. Clinical and empirical research suggests that non-suicidal self-injury functions as a form of emotional avoidance and escape from unwanted emotions. Often youth will tell us that they are cutting in order to feel something. They are trying to escape or avoid the feeling of nothingness emotionally. Okay, so I pulled some CDC data to try to get the most current look at how we rate in Florida. So our overall state rate, but this would include adults, I believe is 27th. Now, this graph that I'm showing you here is just for adolescents aged 15 to 19. And as you can see, the top line is for the United States. The bottom line is for Florida. So as you can see, we're trending up. The next information that I'm going to show you is from, I've pulled some slides from the Risk Behavior Survey Data Summary and Trends Report for 2009 to 2019. So this is a report that provides the most recent surveillance data on health behaviors and experiences among high school students in the United States, which are related to 4 priority areas associated with sexually transmitted diseases and HIV, and includes unwanted pregnancies. So multiple years of this data are used to spotlight 4 areas. I really encourage you to, you can just go on and just type in your search, Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and you'll be able to see the entire report. The report discusses sexual behavior, high-risk substance use, experiencing violence, and mental health and suicide. So they have it arranged by 24 variables that help you better understand the 4 categories that they're focusing on. And they do this, the variables include sex, race, ethnicity, and sexual minority status. Okay, so as you see here on this graph, more high school students experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness from 2009 to 2019. Feelings of sadness or hopelessness are one of the first things that psychologists and mental health providers assess when we have a youth in our office and we're assuming that they are suffering from depression. Okay, so this graph shows you that more male students and female students experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness from 2009 to 2019. Okay, so the next graph indicates that more white students, African-American students, and Hispanic students experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness from 2009 through 2019. Now, in 2019, about 19% of all high school students, nearly 1 in 5, and about 24%, which is 1 in 4, female students had seriously considered attempting suicide during the past year. More female students than male students had seriously considered attempting suicide, and more white students seriously considered attempting suicide than Black students. More students overall had seriously considered attempting suicide from 2009 to 2019. So if you look and you see this legend here, this is basically saying this is going in the wrong direction. Okay, so for both male and female students, the consideration of suicide attempts are going in the wrong direction. Now, by ethnicity, white students and African American students were more likely to seriously consider attempting suicide from 2009 through 2019. In 2019, about 16% of high school students had made a suicide plan during the past year. More female students, 1 in 5, made a suicide plan, more than male students. Okay, so that just shows that the total is going in the wrong direction and more students made a suicide plan through this course of time. This graph shows that more female students made a suicide plan from 2009 through 2019. There was no statistically significant change in the number of males who made a suicide plan during that period. Okay, this one's a little harder to see the lines, but more white students and African American students made a suicide plan from 2009 to 2019. There was not a statistically significant difference in the percentage of Hispanic students who made a suicide plan. So you see these legends right here. All right, now we get into the attempts. In 2019, about 9% of high school students had attempted suicide 1 or more times during the past year. Female students and African American students attempted suicide more than other groups. More female students attempted suicide than male students. And more African American students attempted suicide than white students. Okay, so more students in general attempted suicide during this time period. On this graph, more female students attempted suicide from 2009 through 2019, and there wasn't a significant change here with the males. All right, another busy slide. More white students and more African American students attempted suicide during this time period. Now, in 2019, about 3% of high school students were injured in a suicide attempt that resulted in some form of injury, poisoning or overdose that had to be treated by a physician or a nurse during the previous year. So more female students were injured in a suicide attempt than male students. There was no change during that time period, no significant change in students who were injured in a suicide attempt. So more female students were injured. And there was no change when we look at ethnicity, no significant change. Okay, again, I heavily encourage you to look at the entire report. So now we are going to move on to risk factors. One of the greatest frustrations of researchers and suicidologists is their inability to predict which child or which teen is going to attempt or complete a suicide. The research is limited by ethical issues and constraints on how the research is conducted. But great strides and much research has been completed that identifies risk factors for teenage suicidal behavior. The research has clearly demonstrated that certain predisposing factors combined with certain precipitating factors, which are called distal factors, okay, increase the probability of suicide in teens. The most important distal factor, and I want to stress this, the most important distal factor is previous suicidal behavior. There is a 30-fold increase in risk for boys and a 3-fold increase for girls among those who have had a previous suicide behavior. When clinicians do assessments, it's important to keep 2 key things in mind. A precipitating risk factor, when combined with 1 or more distal risk factors, is what heightens the risk of suicide. And past suicidal behaviors are stronger predictors of future suicidal behavior than any stressful life events or any other what we would call proximal factors. A study that was done in 2005 found that the more problem behaviors an adolescent has, such as violent behavior, binge eating, binge drinking, cigarette smoking, high-risk sexual behavior, anything like that, the greater the risk of suicidal behavior. So if you compare a youth who has 0 problem behaviors, the odds of a medically treated suicide attempt increase with the addition of each new problem behavior. When 6 problem behaviors are present, there's a 277.3 times greater risk of suicidal behavior. Okay, so I cannot stress enough, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior as it relates to suicide. Now, for mental disorders, clinical researchers agree that suicidal behavior among adolescents is associated with diagnosable mental disorders. When psychological autopsies are done post-mortem, studies have reported that over 90% of adolescents completing suicide had a mental illness at the time of their death, although younger adolescents had a rate more along the lines of 60%. The rate of depressive disorders among adolescents attempting and completing suicide ranges from 49 to 64%, depending on the research study. The risk of developing a depressive disorder increases as you get older, but it rises very, very dramatically from the ages of 9 to 19. At any one time, it's estimated that 1 in 20 children and adolescents suffer from major depressive disorder. Bipolar disorders are less prevalent among adolescents, but they have been found in some studies to be a significant risk. High rates of comorbidity, which is a combination of disorders, especially between anxiety and depression, is well documented in children and adolescents. There's increasing evidence from the research that anxiety symptoms are associated with the severity of the depression, and anxiety may be a primary risk factor, especially when it's associated with depression. In one research study, researchers found that adolescents with a history of panic attacks were 3 times more likely to express suicidal ideation than those without a history of panic attacks. Disruptive and impulsive behavior disorders are also common among suicidal adolescents, especially males. And when we were talking about those kids in the earliest age groups, the 5-year-olds who make suicide attempts, that's largely attributable to the impulse control type disorders, the ADHDs, those types of disorders. So, okay. Several researchers have suggested that most completed suicides by adolescents are impulsive acts, and only about 25% of those include evidence of planning for the suicide. So some researchers have hypothesized 2 different classes of adolescent suicidal behavior. A wish to die, which stems from depressive thoughts, and a wish just not to be here for a period of time. And that's more associated with the impulse control disorders. And that is more of what you would find in the earlier ages when we discuss suicidality. For the earliest age group, it's generally been found that the precipitating factor is usually an argument with parents. Now, substance abuse has been found with greater frequency among teens attempting and completing suicides. In studies of substance-using adolescents, suicide attempts occur at rates 3 times those who are not using substances, and with the wish to die increasing dramatically after the onset of the substance use. Okay, so borderline personality disorder has been found over the past 20 years to be an especially important risk factor. Personality disorders and the tendency to engage in impulsive violence have become recognized as critical risk factors for completed suicides among adolescents. Okay. In adolescence, comorbidity is more the rule than it is the exception. And these are often found in adolescents who complete suicides. Generally speaking, suicidal behavior spans diagnostic categories. Disturbed family functioning. Again, when psychological autopsies are done, then you find patterns of communication and interaction, also coupled with parental psychopathology being factors. For gender, this plays out a little differently depending on where you are. In the United States, suicidal ideation and attempts are more common among females, and completed suicide is 5 times more common among 15 to 19-year-old males. So that's the pattern that appears in Western Europe, in New Zealand, in Australia, and in North America. Completed suicides for males and females are equal in some Asian countries, and they're higher among females in China, according to the World Health Organization. Okay, ethnicity. In the United States, youth suicide is most common among Native Americans, and suicide rates are actually higher in the western part of the country than in the eastern part of the country. The reasons for that have been suggested as being less connectedness with the community, higher substance abuse rates, and higher depression rates. Okay, so that group is followed by white adolescents, and then African American youth, and then the lowest rate is among Asian and Pacific Islanders. Hispanics have a relatively low completion rate, but they're more likely than either white or African American adolescents to report suicidal ideation and to have made a suicide attempt. And regarding socioeconomic status, the data has been mixed in the research regarding the effect of SES on suicide. Some studies found that youth attempting suicide have lower SES than community controls even after other social and mental health risks were controlled for. One study found that, interestingly enough, found that African American youth who completed suicide had significantly higher SES than their general counterparts. But the effect was not found, the same effect was not found among white or Hispanic youth who completed suicide. All right, so these are what we consider to be distal factors. Now, the proximal factors are those things that combine with background features. So, stressful life events such as breakups, disciplinary crises, legal problems, humiliation, and arguments are found to be some of the stressful life events in attempted and completed suicides of youth around the world, even after controlling for psychopathology, family, and personality factors. Childhood sexual and physical abuse. In this category, researchers have found that both types of abuse are associated with suicidal behavior, even when controlling for a variety of potentially confounding variables. School difficulties, not working or attending school, and dropping out of high school without a GED are identified as risk factors, even after controlling for psychopathology and social risk factors. Okay, functional impairments from physical disease and injury, especially HIV. This could be a whole topic of another evening, but suicide in the social milieu. Teens are very, very susceptible to suggestion and imitative behavior, since they really are the primary modes of social learning and identity formation. A routine intake question for me is whether a family member or friend has committed or attempted a suicide attempt. I ran across something today, which I didn't include in the data, but I ran across something from the American Academy of Suicidology that said that those who are considered to be affected or exposed, those who know someone personally who has died by suicide, the research suggests that for each death by suicide, 147 people are exposed, okay, have been impacted by a suicide. There's a term that you will see occasionally called suicide contagion. That's where you will see a cluster of suicides, a group that occurs closer in time and in space than would normally be expected in a given community. So that suggests that there is some contagion of suicidality. I really didn't go into all the research that followed that television show 13 Reasons Why, because that seems to be ever changing in the research. There hasn't been, I guess the data's still out. There's still a whole lot of research going on about the impact of social media on suicidality. But I will tell you that anecdotally, about a year ago, I did have a client who had one of these online friends. I guess I would consider them to be like avatars of psychopathology, who suggested that, yes, your life is so awful, you really should commit suicide. And we got to a very scary place. Fortunately, she was able to understand the reasoning that, you know, what kind of friend would actually suggest that you commit suicide. But that is something to truly be watched, is the Facebook, the Twitter, the Instagram, all those things, especially TikTok. Okay, so now I don't even know how to say this in a politically correct way, but the most common method of suicide in the United States, regardless of age, race, or gender, is the use of firearms. The probability of suicide increases 5-fold when you have a firearm in your home. Worldwide, that's in the United States. Worldwide, hanging is the most common method of suicide. The overwhelming majority of attempts involve intentional overdose. I guess what I would say about this is that if you have a youth in your home that you consider to be in crisis, please take the guns to somebody else's home and ask them to lock them up for you until the youth is no longer in crisis. Okay, now we have protective factors. So these are the kind of factors, the first category, that we generally consider areas that help children and teens be resilient. So that's problem solving and conflict resolution skills. Having a very strong connection to family, friends, and community support agencies. Going back to my earlier comments on firearms, restricted access to highly lethal means of suicide. You know, the reason why boys are more successful at completing suicides is they use way more lethal methods. They use the hanging and the firearms. Okay. Cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide and that support self-preservation is a protective factor. Having very easy access to a variety of clinical interventions. Having effective clinical care for mental, physical, and substance abuse disorders. And having the support of ongoing medical and mental health relationships. The warning signs are noticeable changes in eating or sleeping habits, unexplained or unusually severe violent or rebellious behavior, the kind that comes out of the blue, withdrawal from family or friends. Now, we all know that teenagers like to stay in the room a lot, but when kids withdraw from friends, that is a big red flag. So the acting out behaviors, sexual promiscuity, truancy, and vandalism, a dramatic personality change. When you see agitation, restlessness, clear distress or panicky behavior, talking or writing about committing suicide, even jokingly, giving away prized possessions, and doing worse in school. In every session, I asked the kids how they're doing in school. Because when grades drop, and it's been very difficult this year during the pandemic because there's been a lot of difficulty with kids maintaining motivation. But it's something, it's probably one of the first red flags you see with depression. Okay, so moving on here. What to do if you're a parent. Prioritize interacting with children and teens in a positive way. Validate their feelings and model expression of feelings. Try to encourage the adults in the home to talk about feelings. When you come home from work, how are you feeling, honey? I had a rough day. Okay, tell me about it. Talk about those things. Make it safe in your home for kids to discuss their feelings. Talk directly about their concerns and ask directly about suicidal thoughts. It's okay to say, I see you're distressed. I see you're upset. Are you feeling suicidal? One of the myths that has occurred is that you're going to somehow put the idea in their head, and that's not. Just ask directly. Increase their involvement in positive experience, clubs, organizations, sports. Means by which they will be in supervised situations with adults and other kids doing things that keep them busy. Emphasize that privacy ends where safety begins. It is okay to monitor your children's whereabouts and their communications, texting, Facebook, Twitter, and especially TikTok. Recently, I have had multiple clients who have engaged in self-harming behavior that found out about that as a means to help them feel better from TikTok. I don't know how. I went on TikTok myself to try to see if I could find those particular references, and I didn't, but somehow the kids did, because it was too, they were just really upfront about it. Okay, so don't let depression or anxiety snowball. Talk to the school counselors, get in touch with mental health professionals, talk to their primary care physician who can make referrals, but don't let it, if you're concerned, it is very likely that you're right. Okay. Now, remind children and teens who are in treatment not to expect immediate results, because they will not. These depressions and anxiety situations will not resolve in 3 to 4 therapy sessions. Never shrug off threats of suicide as melodrama. So it's important to remember that the risk for suicide is just as high for a perceived crisis as it is for an actual crisis. So, if your teenage daughter comes home and tells you that her heart is broken and shattered in a million pieces because she just broke up with the love of her life, please, parents, don't high-five each other and say, oh, thank heavens, he was such a loser. So, please, empathize with the youth's feeling state, whatever that may be, and however extreme it may seem. Okay, so encourage children and teens not to isolate themselves from their family and from their friends. Recommend exercise, because the endorphins that they will get from the exercise can help counterbalance the cortisol that is increased when they are in states of depression and anxiety. Also, again, I go back to the guns. If guns are kept in the home, please store them safely or move them somewhere else until the crisis has passed. Sorry. Now, what do you do if you're in crisis? Okay, so before, and I hope that everybody took a screenshot of that first slide that Lori showed. Before calling 911, please call CPE. This is the Mobile Crisis Response Team, and they are very highly trained, and they will come out on site and do an assessment. And their goal is to reduce the number of Baker Acts. So please use that first. Please take a shot of this if you didn't get that very first one. Now, in the first slide that Lori showed you as well, you saw the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. This is a network of 170 local and state-funded crisis centers. New rules were adopted by the FCC in 2020, designating a new phone number for Americans in crisis to connect with suicide prevention and mental health crisis counselors. So soon, it's on its way, there'll be a 988, which will be the suicide line equivalent to 911. So the requirement to transition to 988 as the National Suicide Hotline will take effect on July 16, 2022. Under the rules, calls to 988 are going to be directed to this number, which will remain operational during and after the 988 transition. Okay. So I think that probably most of you are not terribly interested in my reference sheet. Okay. I am going to now turn this back over to Lori.
Thank you very much, Dr. King. We appreciate your presentation. And I think it's important for us to note as an audience that the statistics from the youth survey are important because they set the context, because this is a survey, as you stated, of our youth. And so it gives us a direct picture into how our students are responding on an anonymous survey about truly how they're feeling and what they're experiencing in their adolescent years. And so I know, data is important the most, and then the meat of your presentation really for us is what are the signs and how do we help our children when we're seeing some of these signs? So thank you very much. And to join us to facilitate our Q&A panel, please know our audience that you may type questions into the Q&A box. You may do that as an anonymous person or with your name showing, and we'll verbally answer those at this time. And I would like to introduce to you also Dr. Jason Sabo. And Dr. Sabo also is part of the Lee Health team in the Pediatric Behavioral Health Outpatient Clinic. He earned his Master of Psychology and Doctorate of Psychology from Ball State University. And throughout his career, Dr. Sabo has worked in multiple settings, including the public school system, residential treatment, private practice, and the hospital setting. He joined the Lee Health team in 2018, and he currently works as the site lead in their Pediatric Behavioral Health Outpatient Clinic. His clinical specialties are behavioral disorders, anxiety, and depression. Welcome, Dr. Sabo, and we appreciate you facilitating our question and answer time.
Thank you. I want to piggyback off what Lori just said. As a psychologist, part of my job is to assess changes in risk factors. So I compute these risks based off multiple factors. The slides that Dr. King went over on suicide statistics are one of those factors. They help us as mental health providers, educators, teachers, parents, coaches to better identify children at high risk. Those demographics, such as age, gender, race, SES or socioeconomic status, which is financial means, and so on, really help us get a background for what we're looking at. She also addressed the predisposing factors and then the precipitating risk factors. And those are the things that I think are really pertinent to the folks at home. Those are the factors that hopefully we're looking at in our children. One of the things that I think is important as parents, and I want to hit on sort of 5 different topics. It was part of a question that we had, but one of the biggest things that I see as a psychologist, but also as a parent, is just the importance of being involved in our children's lives. The impact of COVID on suicide and mental health has just absolutely wrecked our communities, our nation, because it really changed the way that we behave. It changed the way that we act to things, and it wasn't a natural change; it was a forced change. We're habits of creatures of habit, and so we like to do things that have worked for us, and that was really it was a forced change. So it also then just sort of sped up and put into hyperdrive the trend of becoming a more online culture. It also increased the stress levels of both children and adults. It took away those normal coping skills that we have. And so then what you see is the fallout afterwards. All of those things that we have in our lives, which are I would say, insulations for us. Just like a jacket, the more insulation you have, the more protected you are from the cold. Those are all things that help kids, for risk factors of any mental health disorder, especially suicide. So that would be, sports, it'd be family, school, clubs that they're in, friends, family. All of these layers are there to help the child. When they're feeling down, there's a friend there that can pick them up. When they're having a hard day, there's a sport that they get to go to feel better about themselves. When they're at school, they get to see their friends and communicate. If they're having a hard time, the coach can see that they're behaving differently. And so we have all these layers that are able to really help the child. And those things have really changed significantly. I think that as we start getting back into more of a sense of normalcy, what you'll see is that some of those things will naturally go down because we're able to return to previous functioning. One of the difficulties that I've seen, though, is that many of the kids who previously were involved in activities, now they've become sort of apathetic and complacent. And so now I see a lot of parents who are having difficulty getting their kids back out to do things that they were previously doing. They're having a hard time encouraging, or not encouraging, but motivating their kids. And it's difficult. I think that we often compete against a lot of different things. I always tell the story that when I'm a big college football fan, and when college football is on, it's really difficult for my wife to compete with it. I love her, and I would do anything for her, but my brain just doesn't work like that. And so sometimes it's hard for me to do that. And I think as parents, we're also competing with so many things in our children's lives. And so those things all have an impact. And so I think a lot of the things that have been added in because of COVID are now becoming even greater risk factors. It's the social isolation. It's staying inside, playing on video games. It's addicted to a phone or attached to this phone, and that's their entire life. One of the comments was made about electronics and how do we go about managing that? And I think that's not an easy question. In my opinion, when you give a child any type of electronics, it's because they've earned it. It's because at some point in their life they've showed you that they have the skill level, they have all of the factors that you feel are necessary for them to be able to handle that. A phone is just endless information at their fingertips. It can be positive information. It can also be negative information. And I encourage, just like anything else, is that we monitor that. We look to see if it's being successful at what it's intended to do. If I get my child involved in a sport and they find out that they're not very good at it, and it's hurting their self-image as opposed to helping it, I'm going to try to find a different activity. Same thing with a phone, is that I encourage parents to be a part of that phone and really set it up as, this is my phone that I'm going to allow you to borrow. Here are the factors, or here are the contingencies behind that, and are you willing to abide by that? It doesn't mean that we're hawking over them. It doesn't mean that we're, searching it every night. But I think it is important to allow that child to know that it is something that I will be looking at, just like anything else in their life. If they're hanging out with friends, you should know their friends. You should know their parents' friends, or their friends' parents. You should know all of these things, because that's who your child is going to be around, and those are the influences that your child's going to be around. And so the more that you're aware of that, the better that we can direct our kids, and the better that we can set them up for success. So I think when it comes to electronics, I don't believe in sneaking around. I think that just creates a culture of distrust, but be open with your child about it. The goal isn't to take the phone away, or any electronics for that means. The goal is to create healthy boundaries and give the child the skills so that they can manage that later on in their life. When they become an adult, whether that be the day they turn 18, when they go to college, when they go to their first job, but when they transition into adulthood, we want them to be ready for whatever life throws at them. And that's sometimes hard. We don't necessarily know what that's going to be. As a child or a parent of younger children, that may be preparing them for their first day of school. How do I get them ready? How do I get them to feel comfortable and confident that they're not going to get lost? When they're starting to drive, how do I give them the skills so that they can not get in an accident, pay attention to the things that are important, forget the things that aren't important, like a phone, so that they can be successful in driving and not put themselves in danger. And it's like that for pretty much everything that we do as a parent. I think that the school is also doing that, and what the school is trying to do is teach them to be adapted in multiple different areas. We don't know where children are going to excel or where they're not, and so all of these different things that are being taught to a child are those protective factors that really help kids to be successful later on. Again, the first thing is really be involved in your child's life. The more that you're involved in your child's life, the more that you're going to feel comfortable with all of those different things that they're getting involved in. The second is really having those conversations with your children, just like Dr. King said, is that those conversations are so important. When it comes to suicide prevention, they're even more important, because that's the groundwork that you're laying. If the first time you ever have a real conversation with your child is in the context of suicide, it's going to be very, very difficult. The goal is that they're comfortable talking to you. The goal is that they know that you're going to be there to support them, whether they have good news or bad news, but you're going to be there to help them. And the more that you're able to do that on a daily basis, and that starts at 5 years old, that doesn't start at 14 when you notice a change. That starts early on, whether it be at the dinner table, in the car, making sure you're having conversations and normal conversations. And, how was it for you? Did you enjoy it? What did you think about this? Start those conversations, so then it's a natural thing. The third thing is then listen. So often, and this is something that as a psychologist, we get caught up doing as well, is trying to solve problems. And I think the longer that I've been in psychology, the more that I've found out that my job isn't necessarily to solve everyone's problems. My job is to help them have the skills so that they can solve those problems themselves. Part of that is teaching them to understand what put them in that situation, building the ability for them to identify that in the future. And so listening to a child is so important, because you're going to find out what their coping skills are. You're going to find out what worries they have. You're going to find out what struggles they have. So then when they're having those difficulties, you're able to step in and really be more supportive and helpful in that situation. When they do come to you, make sure that you're rewarding it. This is something that's really, really hard. And I use a story back to when my child was young. We had a little reward system set up for him, that when he had a good day at school, he got some type of a treat when we picked him up. So we kept treats in our car, and it was something really simple. And there were times where I would show up and he had a great day and he earned his treat. But then as I'm getting him to leave, I tell him, hey, don't shoot that basketball again. It's time to go. And he shoots the basketball again. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, like, why'd you do that? Like, I have this reward for you and I really want you to have it. But that's where it's really important to not jump down their throats or not beat them up, but really try to come at them in a more positive way and do your best to encourage, okay, hey, you know what, here's why you got the treat, but because of that behavior, how are we going to handle that in the future, and what can we do to fix that? Is that it's really hard to not get anxious or not get have difficulty when a kid tells us something that's really hard. So if a child comes to us and says, hey, I cut on my arm, I tried suicide, I made an attempt, any of those things, the first thing you want to do is be there to listen to them. That reaction is going to have a huge impact on whether or not they come back to you in the future. And so that's with so many different things. If they're worried about how you're going to react and they're worried about how you're going to react in a negative way, it's based off of history. It's based off of how you've reacted in the past when they've come to you. And so we really want to try to set that up ahead of time. And so that's one of those things that when we lay the groundwork, it makes it so much easier. So trying to do our best to not jump on them right away if they do make a mistake, but try to say, hey, thank you for coming to me. Thank you for opening up to me, and then we go about addressing it, and then again going back to those first ones is listening, and having that conversation with your child. And just like Dr. King said, don't be afraid to use the word suicide. That's a term in our culture. Make sure that you address that with your children. Don't be afraid of it. It's just like substances. It's just like talk on sex. Is that I would rather have that with my child than them learn that on the bus. I would rather have them learn that from me than some child that maybe they got it off the line. I have no idea where they got that from. And so if I'm giving that information, I know that it's going to be appropriate, or it's what I'm okay with. And then the last thing is any change in behavior. Dr. King hit on this as well, but generally, again, we act in predictable ways. And so when we see any change in behaviors, it's important to make sure that we look at those as something has happened. It could be something good, it could be something bad, but anytime there's a significant change in behavior, that's what gets the hair on the back of my neck to stand up. So when I'm in a session and I ask a question and then they change their body posture and they or change the topic, it's like a giveaway to me right away. Okay, this is something I need to get back to and figure out why they had that change in behavior. But a lot of times what we're going to see in the community are bigger things, just like Dr. King said. So it might be withdrawal, it might be reacting differently, it might be isolation. So really being able to pay attention to that. One of the questions that we had prior to the presentation, we had a parent who commented that she had a 9th grade student who had expressed suicidal ideation. That child had been placed in therapy for the past year and is now seeing psychiatry. And she had asked, what are some resources for teens? This goes back to that my comment on insulation, which is, what are you putting around your child, and really trying to get them involved in as many different layers of activities as possible. When you have a depressed child, that's really, really difficult. And I absolutely empathize with parents because they're working extremely hard. One of the things that I know if therapy is going to be really successful is if the patient's working harder than I am. We're on the right path. And I think that's something that's very, very difficult to get to happen when somebody is depressed. But it is so important to make sure that we're getting involved in activities. Those activities stimulate the brain, which then releases dopamine. And that's that feel-good drug that our brain naturally produces. And so what we want to do is try to stimulate that. So there are 4 areas to really look at when you have a child that's struggling. Those 4 areas that we want to make sure that as parents we're watching over is healthy amount of sleep, a healthy diet, physical activity, and then socialization. So getting outside as often as possible, go to a park, walk around, find something to do that requires them to get outside, which will have a huge impact on their mental health. And so it gives them a fighting chance. Another question within that was, what are some support groups or groups for parents to participate in? There's a organization which is NAMI, and that's NAMI.org, and they have a lot of groups and resources that they distribute, and it's just a wealth of information. Another site that I would encourage families to go on is youth.gov, and on that they have if you type in suicide, they have lots of resources. So they even have resources that break it down after the attempt on how to address with a child, and then also within the community. So there's lots of really good resources. And then the next question was within that is, what are options or resources if my teen does become suicidal again? If the child's in therapy, my encouragement is communicate with the therapist and come up with a safety plan. That's something that is pretty standard. And the goal of that is, we know that those days are going to happen. Just like anybody else, we're going to have a hard day. When you're depressed, those hard days are even more difficult. And so when you are feeling down, who do you go to? What's your safety plan? Who are folks that you can talk to? Is it is it mom that you're going to text? And making sure that we have a plan in place in order for when that happens, that we can address it. In terms of receiving facilities, there are two receiving facilities close. One is Salis Care, and then the other is David Lawrence Center in Collier County. Those are receiving facilities, and what that means is that those are designated as sites that, if somebody has made a serious attempt on their life, that's a site that is able to assess and then also provide immediate treatment. That's inpatient treatment generally, which is considered the Baker Act. And so what they do is really help to stabilize the child. And so they're a huge part of that process. And they do, they have a very difficult job. I just have so much respect for folks who work in that area, because it's a very difficult place to work. Most of the time, people don't want to be there when they're there. But I think they do a tremendous job for the difficulty that they have. And Lee Health is not a receiving facility. What we do is we really just clear children if they've made a serious attempt on their life. So they get them medically clear, and then they're transferred to one of those facilities. We had another question, and I'll run through this really quickly, which is, what are the warning signs of impulsive suicidal attempts? These are children, just to sort of clarify, these are children that are both impulsive and aggressive. And that's the scary part of it. So just like Dr. King stated, I previously worked in a correctional facility, which is full of children with a history of both impulsive and aggressive behaviors. Generally, the kids that I saw in there had felonies of aggravated assault, just a lot of very aggressive behaviors. That was a very scary place to work. However, within that, I had a lot of control over the environment. So I was able to make sure that if I had a child that I felt was at danger or at risk, they were monitored 24 hours a day. It's a very difficult process because it requires a lot of man hours, but it's something that I had at my disposal, and so when necessary, I use that. In our environment, we're just not able to control everything. It's impossible. It is absolutely impossible for a parent to be around 24/7. It's impossible for somebody to be with the child 24/7. Is that you're going to go to the bathroom, there's going to be things. And so that's where it's a little bit more difficult. And that's where, just like Dr. King was saying, those risk factors are so important to know and understand, because those are the kids that we're going to be more worried about. So the question of the impulsive, suicide attempts and warning signs of it, look at the slides that Dr. King had presented on are just, I think she nailed it, in that what we really need to look for is, what's that history? And just like anything else, history is the best predictor of the future. And so when we look back at our child, if they hit on multiple of those factors, the predisposing and the precipitating, that's when we're going to be more concerned. And then I would really encourage, if you have a child that is in any of those categories, make sure you're having a conversation with them. Make sure that you know it's okay that they come to you if they're feeling down or if they feel like hurting themselves, because then they're going to be significantly more likely to do it. The prevention, just like in so many things, is way more powerful than intervention. And so I would encourage parents to really try to do that as often as possible, is have those conversations. So I will now turn it back over to Lori, and there's a couple of questions, or I think at least a question that was related to the school, so I'll allow her to answer that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabo. I'm just peeking through some of the questions, and we had a few that had some common themes, and two that are related more to foundational learning. This question is really, why are we not teaching mental health coping mechanisms in schools? And along those lines was another question about, what are we teaching to students to help them with mental and emotional wellness? And those are excellent questions. And as the viewers on our call and the parents on our webinar tonight know, we have Wellness Wednesdays for parents tonight, and we are engaging in that every Wednesday, once a month for 10 Wednesdays. We do provide required mental and emotional wellness to students in grades 6 through 12. And so along those lines, we are talking with students about these topics, and then also about some coping strategies so that they can kind of build their coping skills toolbox with each of those learning opportunities, and really pick which strategies work for them. Along the same vein, we also have social emotional learning in our K-12 schools, where we're laying the foundation for students to understand what are my emotions? If I'm, what does anger look like? What does frustration look like? And identifying those emotions all the way from pre-K through the continuum all the way through grade 12. And it's done in a scaffolded way so that learning continues to build every year. And then when I identify emotions, how can I, in a healthy way, handle those emotions? And so we do have foundational learning. Are we in this perfect situation where we're able to engage in this consistently more than the Wellness Wednesdays events? Not right now. So for social emotional learning, we are. Our schools are expected to engage in SEL, we call it, that's teacher led in the classroom and embedded into the kind of the fabric of what we do as we educate students. Our Wellness Wednesdays are more to make sure that we are targeting certain mental and emotional wellness topics that the Department of Education is saying we really need to be touching on every year, and scaffolding that knowledge up for our students. So we're helping them build that skill set. So we just started that, and we're in the second year of that. Every district across Florida is in their second year of implementation. So the other question related to the school district also is, what are the resources for parents and students in Lee County, and how do we access layers of services in our schools? And so we have school mental health professionals. These are our school counselors, social workers, school psychologists, and our licensed mental health professionals in all of our schools. And they make up the school mental health team. And school-based mental health is a continuum of services from that kind of universal prevention and learning that we're doing with social emotional learning and Wellness Wednesdays. These are the things that all students need. And then for kids that may need more, there may be times that they don't necessarily need mental health support as far as formalized mental health pathways in our school system. They might just need some temporary support from their school counselor or social worker. I think of the student who is going through a breakup, and they're just struggling for a period of time trying to make sense of that. Typically, our school counselors and other staff will provide some short-term support to that student. But if a student's going through a breakup and they're experiencing a period of sadness that is prolonged and there's concern, that's when our mental health team will discuss the student and also talk with the parent and engage the parent in accessing the services we can do through our school-based staff or referral pathways into community behavioral health. And that really puts our parents and the student in that driver's seat of the mental health team asking the parent, would you consent for us to do a screener? So maybe we can determine the level of potential anxiety or challenge that your student is experiencing. And then we reconvene as a team with the parent and talk through what the screener showed. And can we serve that through school-based appropriate services, or would we like them to consider a referral? And we don't push anything. It's really up to students and parents to determine their next steps. But we're here to serve and also to assist in any way that we can. So Dr. Sabo, I may go ahead and do we have some others? I think we have some other questions related to tonight's topic that.
Yes, I got two of them. So one is, how can a parent instill problem solving and conflict resolution? I think that was based off of maybe one of my comments, which is awesome because it leads to the next Wellness Wednesday, which is going, actually, no, I'm sorry, 2 Wellness Wednesdays from this, which is going to be on resiliency, and that's one that I'll be leading. And really my goal in that is to look at the problem solving skills that we teach our kids in all different developmental levels and how we go about helping them become, a whole person. And so that's a little plug for my next session or part in it. So hopefully you tune into that. Another question I had was, a family friend tried to commit suicide. Do you recommend me telling my children? Which that's a really difficult question. I don't know that I can directly answer that. What advice I would give is that understand that children are all different, and also at different developmental stages, they're able to handle different types of information. First, I would make sure that it's okay to share that information because that's important for the person who did make an attempt on their life. And so make sure that it's okay there first. But then I think if you know your children and you feel as though they can handle it, that's an absolute conversation that I would have. And even if you can't use that individual's name, just say, hey, this is something that I've been thinking about. And it means a lot to me because you mean a lot to me. And I want to make sure that you understand how much I love you and how much I care about you. And then just lead into it that way. Again, it's so important to have those conversations, and any way that you can start that conversation is going to be helpful and important. Do you have any more, Lori, that you've seen? I'll start reading through as well.
I do, and this one is addressed to myself and Dr. King. What would you suggest a teacher do if we start to see several warning signs in our students? We have a mental health team at our school, but the team is limited based on parental consent, and that is correct that, parental consent is necessary for us to provide formalized school-based mental health services or referrals. And so I would like to address that from the district side, and then I would love it if you have additional information from the community behavioral health side. Our teachers can engage in youth mental health first aid training, trauma training. We have a variety of trainings that would help our teachers understand, and this particular person may already have gone through that training if they're a teacher, signs and symptoms of the most common adolescent mental health challenges. Also, what is typical adolescent development versus what could be atypical? And then how do you approach a student? And really, how do you ensure you listen non-judgmentally and ask them some deeper probing questions and then connect them to appropriate help within the school building, including help from their trusted adult, which typically is a parent, guardian, or caregiver. So we do have trainings, and then also you can use your school counselors, your school social workers, et cetera, the school mental health professionals to talk through the challenges you're seeing. And, parents are our partners in this great good work. They send their most prized, loved person to school every single day. And those are the students we serve. And, inherent in that is their right to be the guiding voice in their child's life. And we want to honor and respect that. So sometimes it takes multiple conversations and multiple times of us to offer things to them, and the have you thought ofs and how can we assist, because trust isn't necessarily a natural thing that happens. And we're all coming from our own context and working through our own pieces of what's going on in our lives. And so those are multiple layers of conversations and touch points a lot of times with students and parents. It's not typically a one and done. And so those are some of the strategies we can use to continue to help a student while they're at school, engage the family, and consistently support them. You also heard Dr. Sabo talking about how as parents, we can make sure that we engage a certain way with our students and our children when they tell us things that might be hard for us to hear. We're not quite sure, how do I handle this? And they're kind of gauging our response and our facial expressions, et cetera. And I think really the more that even as teachers, when kids come to us, we show that non-judgmental posture and the verbiage, and we just ask them more and we say, I'm here for you. And who else have you talked to about this? That's our way to gauge too, who's the trusted adult that they may be talking to outside of just talking to you as the teacher in that building, because we want to start connecting them back to their trusted adult in their family and whatnot, so that we have a network of people to support them. So I hope that answered that question. Dr. Sabo, there's a question, and also Dr. King, how do eating disorders tie into depression? And I do want to remind everyone that our topic in April will be about depression in children, but that's actually an excellent question.
I'll be happy to take that, Lori. Okay.
Thank you.
So one of those risk factors is disordered eating. So it does tie in directly to suicide risk. Typically when we talked about comorbidity, typically when you see youth with disordered eating, you also see some other things going on, some depression, some anxiety. So when you see signs of that, that would certainly be an indicator that mental health treatment is warranted. It's a great question.
If you don't mind me interjecting, there's another question. Is there a plan to add an educational program on how to deal with loss and death, since it's been so prevalent in everyone's lives? That is on our short list of topics. Absolutely. Grief and support for children and adults that have experienced loss. That will be in our early fall topic. Our back to school topic will be anxiety. And then after that, we will be talking through helping our children and our adults, because this is for us as much as it's for them, cope with loss. So thank you for that question.
I have another question that I just saw, which is what would be a more obvious sign for a 7-year-old with impulsivity, such as with impulsivity, when he says he wants to die, is generally after something happens or after a fight with his friends. That's one of those things that I think it is difficult, because I think it's become very normal verbiage for a lot of kids, and so then it becomes even more scary, because now it's something that I think it just makes us more aware. But those things are out there, and they've been out there for a long time. It's just that now we're hearing it. And so if you're hearing your child say that, I think of two things. One is, first, you deal with whatever that issue is. So if they're angry, talk to them about being angry, and then after that, once that emotion has died down, I think it's really important to talk to them about, hey, while you were frustrated, you made this comment. When as a psychologist, I always look at the behavioral aspect of anything that I do, that it's the ABCs of behavior. So what happens before, during, and after. is going to explain a lot. So when a child says that, I think about what are they getting out of it? What are they trying to do? We don't ever call the bluff, but in the moment, sometimes if we jump on it right away, it can actually be counterproductive. And so what we want to do is address the emotion first, and then once the emotion dies down, then address that behavior. And so that becomes, I think, a good way of handling it. And I would say that's not only for 7-year-olds, but pretty much any age. So we want to address the behavior, but generally what I try to do is I try to remove the emotion from that statement. And by doing that, then what we're trying to do is build in other healthy skills when they have that emotion, because they're going to experience frustration. Unfortunately, part of our job as parents is to frustrate them, not intentionally, but it's to set limits for them, and that is frustrating to them. And so it's helping them build skills to handle whenever we frustrate them, by telling them, no, you can't have ice cream for dinner. No, you can't stay up until 2 o'clock. No, you can't fill in the blank. Those are all things that are going to exasperate our children. And so when it does, let's build in skills so that they can handle that, because if they can handle it in my house, I know that they're going to be able to handle it in the school. I know they're going to be able to handle it on the playground. I know they're going to be able to handle it outside playing with their friends.
If I can add on to that, I would just like to add a comment. While I was speaking, I talked about there being sort of two orientations towards the suicidal intent. One being, I want to die, and the other being, I don't want to be here right at this moment or for a period of time. And so a 7-year-old who's saying I want to die is trying to communicate distress. And so it's important to just talk to them about what's distressing them. So, because it's most likely they're just wanting to, what they're saying is, I don't feel like I want to be here right now. But it's unlikely that, because 7, kids don't really have the full concept of, they may have an idea of the permanence of death, but they don't have the full understanding, the ramifications of that until they're in adolescence. So I would just try to get to the root of what's distressing the child.
So to our audience, we are coming up on 8:33, and I'm thinking that maybe what we could do is share some of the questions that we were unable to answer, and there's only a few actually, and I will have to determine with our IT staff if we're able to type up responses and send them to all the attendees for the questions that were not answered. I think that we can do that. These questions were outstanding. And so are there any others to my staff on the webinar, and also to Dr. King or Dr. Sabo, that you see before we wrap, that you would like to answer to the entire audience live?
Lori, I would just, there were several questions regarding like kind of the theme of like, how do I get my child won't talk to me, my child doesn't respond to me, and how do I deal with that? And basically, what I always recommend is that just what we call being present. Just you being present to them and letting them know that you are there to support them. They may not want to talk to you right now. They might not want to talk to you tomorrow, but just the consistency of you saying, hey, I'm here for you. And sometimes it's just being in the same room. It's not even saying a word. It's just giving them that sense that you are there and that sense of safety. So the fact that you're asking those questions means that you're already probably there for your child, and just hang in there and give them the opportunity to kind of process and think and just be present with them. So I just want to answer that question.
I can do a real quick one. There was, what does SES mean? Well, that means socioeconomic status. Okay. Financial status.
I actually think, as I'm scrolling through, we really have answered the majority of questions. There was one related to any books we can suggest to help students with building self-esteem. And that is something that we may need to push out in an email. because we have several books. It depends on the age group. And so here's what I would encourage the person who posed that question to just go ahead and give us an email. My email address was on the invitation you received when you signed up for the webinar tonight that contained the link. And our team will go ahead and compile some suggested resources. And in that email, if you could include the age group you're looking for, we certainly can provide some suggested books that we even have in our own libraries available for school counselors to use with children, and also for parents, obviously, to use with their children. So there are some individuals that are asking for certain slides to be shown, because they'd really be interested in reading them a little more thoroughly. And so I want to remind everyone that this presentation is live on YouTube, and it will be available for on-demand viewing from this point forward. As soon as our IT team processes it, we'll get it posted, and you are welcome to watch it again and again, and also fast forward to the slides that you're interested in. So, I do believe that we are ready to wrap up. Any final thoughts from our panel this evening before we wish everyone a good and safe evening?
Just thank you for having me. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
There is one question that was asked about Dr. Szabo's position in the school system. So I don't know if we want to clarify Dr. Szabo's role. And
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So I do not work for the school system, but I work with the school system. I'm a part of the Lee Health behavioral health team. So I work at Golisano Children's Hospital in the outpatient clinic. But I do a lot of activities with and for the school. And so it's a collaboration that we've been working on. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to work together and help children of Lee County and also surrounding areas.
And you've actually segued us right into the fact that the school district with Golisano Children's Hospital and Kids Minds Matter, we're very grateful for our partnership and also our ability to engage our expert presenters, Dr. King this evening, on suicide signs and risk factors and how do we work with our children when we have these concerns. Dr. Szabo, thank you so much for your help facilitating and your expertise this evening. And also we look forward to your presentation on building resiliency in children in May. And we just are so grateful to both of you and to Golisano Children's Hospital Kids Minds Matter, because you are serving our children therapeutically and ensuring too that the school district and Lee Health can come together, because after all, we are all engaged in this great and good work. Our children need us. They need all of you, our wonderful parents and our teachers on the call tonight. And it truly does take a village and a systems of care approach. And so I thank you again for your expertise, parents and staff. I thank you, community members, for all of your attendance tonight and the great questions you asked. We will see you on April 28th at 7 p.m. You'll receive notifications on that to talk through depression in children. And then again on May 26th, with Dr. Szabo on building resiliency in children. As we head into summer, it will give us some really good tools to work with our kids over the summer on making sure that we're helping them continue to build that coping skills and resiliency toolbox. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.